As a culture, we're becoming increasingly aware of how widespread trauma is and of the huge emotional and physical costs of those who carry it. We're becoming aware of the damage that it creates in our communities and in our wider societies through the way that it affects how we parent children, how we interact with each other, how it creates the background environment against which far too many people live their lives. And I believe that addressing trauma individually and on a societal level is vital if we're going to prevent it from becoming ever more prevalent. However, there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what trauma is, and unless we develop greater clarity, we won't be able to engage with it as effectively as we might. 15 years ago, I started exploring the phenomenon of trauma, mainly for personal reasons. But alongside my own inner work, I studied and interviewed some of the leading researchers and clinicians of today. They came from 3 different fields: psychotherapy, neurobiology, and evolutionary anthropology. When people think about trauma, they think about being the victim of harm, and they perceive that the trauma resides in those harmful experiences themselves. But that's a misunderstanding, and one that we need to correct if we're going to be able to create the personal and the social environments that can facilitate healing. Trauma means a wound, a shock, or an injury. Thus, it does not reside in the harmful experiences per se, but in their impact on us. When we suffer from pain that's unbearable, they develop an unconscious conviction that their life is at risk. And as a result of that, our minds and our bodies activate various systems whose sole purpose is aimed at survival. And once these systems have been activated, we live our lives from inside a biological and psychological world that is fundamentally different to the world that we would have lived in previously. I call this a trauma world. And it is entry into this trauma world which defines trauma, not the original events. So what constitutes a trauma world? Well, that will vary from person to person. Every trauma world will be unique. But there are 3 systems that are active in all trauma worlds. There's an embodied fear of re-traumatization. There's a propensity to dissociate, to cut off from parts of ourselves. And our identity will become rooted in shame. I'll talk about each in turn, but for now I need to emphasize that there's no conscious decision to enter a trauma world. It's what human brains and bodies have evolved to do in the face of overwhelming pain and fear. What's more, a trauma world is not created in the thinking parts of our brain, the parts that are accessible to everyday awareness and to language, but rather in the hidden biological systems, in our hormones, in our nervous system, and in the structure of our brain, and those parts of those systems which underlie our feelings and the ways that we perceive the world and interact with the world and with people around us. And that means that we have little awareness that we're locked into this kind of world, into a world that's organized around fear, dissociation, and shame. But that is the reality, and it's a reality which distorts how we see ourselves and others. And as a result of the way that we behave because of that, we're going to create repetitive and self-perpetuating cycles of trauma, both for ourselves and because of how we're interacting. We're going to create the kind of environments which might well constellate trauma in others. So what kinds of experiences create trauma? Well, the most obvious ones are the ones that are currently in the news, like physical and sexual abuse, extreme neglect, growing up among violence, experiencing war, or witnessing atrocities. More hidden, but equally damaging, is growing up feeling inadequate, unvalued, or unloved. Trauma is also triggered in infants and young children when they have parents and caregivers who are unable to attune to them in a sensitive way, perhaps because those caregivers are traumatized themselves, maybe because they're stressed, maybe because they're depressed or ill. Sometimes the original traumatizing experiences happen to our parents and grandparents rather than to us. And then it is their fears and their distorted perceptions which are inherited from them, which lie at the heart of our trauma world. So turning now to the 3 systems that form the core of a trauma world, I'll begin by talking about fear. The first response to emotional wounding is that our minds and our bodies become extremely sensitive to potential danger. It's not conscious. It happens through changes that take place in our hormones, in our nervous system, in the structure of our brains. But what it means is that we look at other people and the world around us through a haze of anxiety and distrust. And we often see danger where none exists. And then we react to that imagined danger in the very way that brings about the situations that we most fear. Our fear system becomes particularly sensitive around our original traumatizing experiences. At the core of a trauma world is the defiant cry of never again will I be re-traumatized. But never again can cause as much pain as the original wounding. In an attempt to avoid anything that seems to resemble the traumatizing experiences, we try to control the situation, other people, and ourselves. Often that attempt at self-control is unconscious, but at some subtle or less subtle level, we effectively become control freaks. One way that unconscious need for control can be played out is through distorted beliefs, which we are certain represent our truth. Say we lost our caregiver when we were a young child. To ensure that never again did we experience similar loss, we might develop an unconscious belief that we're not really lovable, because with a belief like that, we wouldn't let anyone get close enough to us, and so we wouldn't have to risk the pain of possibly losing them had we let them in and then they disappeared again. There are a myriad of different distorted beliefs that can become part of a trauma world. They're all individual, but all lead to a profound inner loneliness, because all leave us abandoning a genuine part of ourselves. In this particular example, the need for connection and for love. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid situations that appear similar to the ones that traumatized us. Then our old trauma comes back to life, not as a memory of the past, but as a living knee-jerk reaction. A bit like riding a bicycle. When you get on a bicycle now, you don't remember your stages of learning to ride it. There's an embodied reaction so that you can balance. However, with trauma, when we're unaware that it's come back to life when it gets triggered in that way. And so we believe that what we're feeling right now is the reality of right now. The second system that forms a trauma world is dissociation. Dissociation is part of the mammalian defense system. In extreme situations when we need to escape, we need to not feel the pain. But in a trauma world, it becomes part of everyday life. And then it's harmful because it cuts us off from our own reality, as well as from the reality of the situation. There's several types of dissociation which are common to trauma. When those upon whom we depend can't accept some aspect of who we are, maybe our anger or our tears, maybe our joy or our sexuality, we cut off that part of ourselves. It's not a conscious decision, but once it's happened, we build our lives around this half-person who we have become. And that leaves us feeling insecure. We're worried that we'll be discovered as a fraud. We're not standing on our own ground because we've cut off part of ourselves. We don't feel quite real. There's a sense of emptiness. Sometimes it's not a specific part of our personality that we cut off, but emotions more generally. When pain and fear are overwhelming, we numb out and block those feelings from consciousness. We have to get through everyday life, to get through school if we're kids, to get through whatever's required of us as adults. But we can't block out pain and fear without cutting off from all emotions, or for dulling them down. And when we do that, we can't engage with other people and with the world around us in a vibrant way. And then we feel life feels a bit flat and it feels a bit depressed. We're very prone to suffering from depression at that point. And we also feel less than fully human because we see our friends and other people around us being much more engaged with life, and we feel that that's not really for us. Cut off from our emotions, we're also denied the information that would help us to find our way through the world. Emotions are a product of evolution, and they evolved to tell us whether what's happening around us is good or whether it's bad. When we're dissociated from our feelings and they're dulled, we don't have access to the nuances and the texture of that kind of information can give us. And without that information, it's harder to find our way in the world, and so the sense of danger that's already part of a trauma world is made worse. Shame is the third system that's intrinsic to trauma worlds. It is a visceral and all-pervasive feeling of being fundamentally flawed and inadequate as a human being. Shame is often confused with guilt, but with guilt we feel bad about the things we've done. With shame we feel bad about who we are. Guilt is about actions. Shame is about being. Shame is mediated by the emotional brain. So although it's often accompanied by self-critical thoughts like I'm stupid, useless, fat, pathetic, ultimately it's lived as a total experiences that lodges beneath thoughts and words and sucks us into the psychological equivalent of a black hole. Shame is also a product of evolution, and it can be felt as a passing emotion in everybody. But with emotional trauma, it becomes an enduring part of our ongoing identity. Instead of just feeling it for a moment, it becomes who we are. And then we can't step outside it and see it for what it is. Instead, we have no choice but to see ourselves through shame-tinted glasses. We become the object of our own contempt. At some deep level, we feel ourselves to be a victim of our own supposed inadequacy. And then we try and bully and indeed shame ourselves into success. We try to force ourselves to become more than we are, often striving for perfection, in the vain hope that if only we can become perfect, then that gnawing pain of feeling sort of inadequate, really at the core of our being, will finally go away. But when we try and shame ourselves into change, all we do is create more shame. It's not only our relationship with ourselves which is poisoned by shame. Our relationship with other people is equally distorted. We're terrified that if they get to know us, we'll be abandoned or attacked. And in a conscious attempt to prevent that imagined danger from happening, we put up barriers, we push people away, or we try to gain power over them, perhaps using force, or we might try to manipulate them through being a martyr or through being hyper-nice. We're not conscious that we're doing any of this. It's kind of learnt very slowly over years and years and years. But we aren't having real relationships. And so at some level we feel increasingly isolated. Also because we sense that our relationships aren't quite real, that we're not quite relating to other people and that they're not quite relating to us in a really meaningful way. The conviction that there's something wrong with us as a human being gets worse. And so we go deeper into shame. Shame creates more shame. So how can trauma be healed in ourselves and in others? The systems that constitute trauma are so deeply ingrained in our bodies and our brains that we as individuals and also as a society struggle to see trauma for what it is. Instead, our focus is drawn to the visible symptoms and to the chronic deadening pain which they create. I've already talked about how trauma can create anxiety, dissociation, and a deep sense of inadequacy. Other symptoms include addictions, eating disorders, self-harm, rage, as well as feeling stuck in our lives, struggling with relationships, sabotaging the things that we care about. Focusing on these symptoms, we put our energy and our resources into trying to alleviate them. That's of limited use. Until we recognize and engage with the underlying trauma, we're sticking plasters over broken bones. And so we're not going to get any really solid and lasting change that we can really rely on. Even when people can see beneath the symptoms to the underlying trauma, the first port of call is usually to blame whoever or whatever caused those original wounds and to look for retribution. That's okay as a first step. We do need to recognize what happened to us. We do need to validate it, and we need to know that it's happened not because there's something wrong with who we are, but it is only a first step. And focusing on those traumatizing experiences or on punishing the perpetrators won't bring lasting healing because it can't change the eternal systems created in the wake of those traumatizing experiences. The next step, and to truly heal trauma, requires the courage to recognize that ultimately our lives are compromised, not by the original traumatizing experiences per se, but by the inner trauma world that was created in their wake. And we need to recognize that reality without blame and judgment. We need to understand that that's what human beings do in order to survive. And at the same time, we have to take responsibility for transforming those survival systems and for finding our own way out of that trauma world. So how do we do that? Well, a cognitive awareness of the traumatizing experiences and of the systems that were created in their wake is a start, but it is not enough. Exploring the past from a safe distance won't bring lasting change. Instead, we have to go into our emotional bodies and our minds and slowly get to know what we carry from inside of our feelings. We need to engage with our trauma and find different ways of relating to it. Change happens in the present moment through lived experience. And the first thing that needs to happen as part of that lived experience is that we need to become more tolerant of the original traumatizing pain. Pain tells us that something's wrong. We've evolved to want to get out of pain and to avoid it. But at the root of our trauma world is the acute pain, which was previously too much for us to bear. And so long as we remain frightened of that pain, we have no choice but to keep our survival systems rigidly in place and for never again to be the organizing principle of our lives. Opening to our original pain is not enough in and of itself to bring healing. We also have to work directly with the survival systems created in both mind and body in response to that traumatizing pain. For example, we have to reconnect to whatever has been dissociated. That's frightening. We dissociated these parts of ourselves to protect ourselves from being re-traumatized. When we approach these parts, our fear system is automatically reactivated. It's a bit like, you're living in the African plains and you get mauled by a lion, and suddenly you're saying, actually, we're going to now go up and try and pet a lion. Everything in you is saying, you've got to be joking, you're completely crazy. And so driven by that imperative of never again, our survival systems will do everything they can to prevent us from reconnecting to what was branded as dangerous all those years ago and what was genuinely dangerous for us to live all those years ago. And if that means sabotaging the healing process, then so be it. One of the hardest parts of healing trauma is challenging the power of that internal survival system. But if we can take on that system successfully enough to reconnect to the parts that we've dissociated, we can begin to build a more vibrant and meaningful life, one that's securely rooted in the entirety of who we are, rather than in this half person we became to survive. Equally critical to healing trauma is that we engage with our shame. So long as our identity is underlain by shame, there is no healing. But the core of shame lies in our emotional brains and in our bodies. Although a cognitive awareness of our shame is important and is a first step, we need to go beyond or beneath that and work from inside our feelings of shame. And that leaves us feeling terrifyingly exposed and vulnerable. We cannot heal emotional trauma by ourselves. We need help. That help can come from a counsellor, a therapist, a teacher, a social worker, or a healing group. But it's what we experience within the context of healing relationships that transforms the fear, the dissociation, and the shame that lie at the heart of a trauma world. And that has consequences for people who accompany others through healing. Because of our neurobiology, because of who we are as human beings, those who help others to heal must have worked deeply with their own trauma. Otherwise, they can't create the kinds of relationships which offer new experiences. It's like learning to speak and inhabit a new language like Chinese. We're learning to speak and inhabit a new emotional language if we're going to heal trauma. And to learn that language, our teacher must speak that language, rather than simply understand its grammar in a theoretical way and being able to recognize the characters when they're written down on a page. What does it mean to be healed? When we embark on trying to heal trauma, we typically imagine that we will reach a place where our lives are free from the pain and the fear arising from our wounds, where trauma no longer has any effect on our lives. That is not what happens. We cannot change the past. Our wounds remain part of us. But what can be changed is their impact. And to achieve that, we have to find new and healthier ways of being with the pain and the fear that's embedded in those wounds, and we have to transform the trauma world which was developed around them. It's a challenging process. It takes time. Successive governments have adopted short-term cognitive therapy which focuses primarily on the thinking brain as their treatment of choice. However, to heal trauma, we need to work directly with the emotional brain and with the physical body. And that requires longer-term relational therapy. And if we as a society want to address trauma in a meaningful way, then we need to provide that longer-term relational therapy in our health system, in our schools, and in our social services. And I believe it's vitally important that we do that, both to help those who are traumatized, and also because when we carry unaddressed trauma, we have no choice but to relate to our children, our family, our neighbours and our colleagues through a distorting veil of fear, dissociation and shame. And that then fosters the kind of social and emotional environments which create yet more trauma and suffering in others. It becomes a vicious spiral. In contrast, as we transform our survival systems and make our way out of our trauma worlds, we break that spiral and start relating to other people and to the world around us in much healthier ways. Ways that are healthy not only for ourselves, but also for the communities in which we live.
For those of us who are working with children, with schools, parenting children, what are the sorts of things we can do to start that healing process with young children and young people?
One of the main factors in whether a painful experience becomes traumatizing or not is, do we have anybody we can talk to about who can see us in that experience, who can validate it? Crucially important, if kids have somewhere where they can actually talk about it, somebody that they can talk to, some kind of safe space, that makes a phenomenal difference. They, can learn that it's not them, it's not necessarily that there's something wrong with them. The problem is that you can't take away these kids' defense systems if they're still living in an environment that's traumatizing. So if there's problems at home, you've got to be able to be working with the parents and trying to change that environment. But even if you're not doing that, just having somebody at school or in a club, a teacher who understands you, can make a phenomenal difference. And it's just about listening. It's not about saying, oh, well, it's okay, because it's not okay.